Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Friday, August 16th, 2013. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. We have a lot of stuff to talk about today. Our phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Sam is in our control room, ready to answer the phone when you call on him with your commentary about what's going on in the world today. A little bit of a program note. Normally, Claire joins us in our third hours on Fridays, but today she is working on a special secret project for What Really Happened and has decided to step away from the microphone for a couple of weeks. She will be coming back, but she's not going to be with us in the third hour today. So it's just you and I for the duration of the program when you call on in. Now, today's actually a holiday here in Hawaii. It's Statehood Day, the day when the United States completed its plan to steal Hawaii away from the Hawaiian people. And I have an article I put up at whatreallyhappened.com that I actually wrote quite some time ago, how Hawaii is not legally a state. And you need to remember, back during the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton signed a public law proclamation admitting that, yes, the U.S. illegally annexed Hawaii, and the Hawaiian people never really surrendered their sovereignty. They're an independent people. Basically, what he was saying is, yes, we admit stealing your country from you, but we're not going to give it back. We'll make you a Native American tribe, like all those wonderful Native Americans out there in the American desert that nobody else wants. And, of course, the Hawaiian people are saying, thank you, no. They want their country back. So you might want to take a look at that article. And the reason I mention it is when I first wrote that article, which was back when the U.S. federal government debt was only $7 trillion instead of $70 trillion, I got a lot of angry emails saying, oh, this is ridiculous. The government wouldn't behave in such a disreputable fashion. And, of course, today we know better. We know the U.S. federal government simply ignores inconvenient laws. Laws are just for the slaves to have to follow. We're the elite. We are above the law. Just like Alan Greenspan was saying back there about the Federal Reserve. We're above the law. So forth and so on. Very bizarre story, and it's actually on the corporate media, which is cause for suspicion right there, how the CIA has declassified the existence of Area 51 out there in Nevada. You know Area 51. It's right after Area 50 and just before Area 52. And it's just a region of desert out there by the Groom Lake Flight Test Center. And I wonder why they're bothering to declassify it, because we all know it's there. You can even see it in Google Earth. It's out there. It used to be the most top secret military base that was out there. And I'm wondering why they're making this a big news story now, because everybody knows Area 51 is out there. Everybody knows Groom Lake is out there. And I have to wonder, are they really desperate enough in the White House to distract us all from Floodgate that now they're down to waving UFOs and space aliens at us? And do they really think that the independent media and the blogosphere are going to drop all of their concern and commentary about NSA spying on the American people, state of the economy, the ongoing wars of conquest, and run off to the desert to look for little flying saucers? Boy, they got to be really desperate to be trying that one. But we're seeing a lot of desperation, panic, and thrashing from within the administration here. It almost seems like the United States at this point in history doesn't have a coherent foreign policy. Al-Qaeda used to be the enemy. Now they're our allies in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood were our friends. The U.S. government was sending them their money until now in Egypt. It almost seems like nobody has a really clear idea of what's happening in Egypt, except that it's out of control. And that, of course, is a terrible threat to people who are hooked on their power freak mentality here. But the Egyptian military are clearly acting in an undemocratic fashion with this horrible crackdown on protesters. And it does seem like things are getting much, much worse for the people of Egypt. They're literally setting the stage for a dictatorship. They've declared a month-long state of emergency. They're just shooting people at random. It's a campaign of terror. The Egyptian police are authorized to use deadly force against people standing there protesting peacefully. That's hardly a democratic situation. And everybody else is still trying to figure out what the heck is going on. Was Morsi ousted over his plan to send the Egyptian military against Syria's Assad? Was he ousted because maybe he was dragging his feet a little too long in doing so? We know that early in his career, early in his administration, Morsi was gaining a very strong reputation in the Mideast for standing up to the U.S. and Israel. Then he flip-flopped. They met his price, and he started, oh, yes, we're going to send Egyptian people to fight in Syria. So nobody's really sure exactly what's going on, except that the majority of the Egyptian people do not agree with Morsi's ouster. I think the last poll anybody had on it was something like 69% of the Egyptians were opposed to the removal against Morsi, which is why this whole thing is just exploding in violence. And the violence is pretty much on the side of the Egyptian government and some obvious agent provocateurs that are going out there to burn churches so they can scream at the American religious right. Oh, those protesters, they're burning churches. And again, nobody seeking socio-political change in a country goes out and commit acts that will destroy public support. When you are seeking to reform a nation, bring back democracy, restore the republic, whatever you want to call it, you don't go out and commit acts that will alienate you in the court of world opinion. Those are always carried out by agent provocateurs working for the people you oppose to blame on you. False flag attacks here. We're going to grab a phone call. Keith in Montana. Aloha, Keith. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hello there, Mike. Yeah, hey, I sent you a video on those staged Egyptian injuries and stuff like that.
Yeah, I did see it. I haven't put it up yet. I was still wanted to look at it very, very carefully and see what was in the videos. But again, in this day and age, dominated by the media and with the media itself dominated by the independent media, these wars are being mostly fought in the area of public perception. And there's a huge amount of fraud going on, which we saw at the Boston bombing. We saw it in the aborted coup d'etat against Iran in 2009. And yes, we are seeing a lot of it over there in Egypt, attempting to demonize the other side, and the Egyptian government has openly admitted they're mounting a major public relations campaign to demonize any Egyptian people not willing to support the new military government. And it's already falling apart. Mohammed al-Baradei's already resigned. He said, I don't want any part of this. This is going nowhere.
Yeah. Right at the end of the video, it says, stand with Israel.
Ah, interesting. I hadn't gotten that far in it. Well, that tells us that Israel's a player in the current turmoil in Egypt, which is what Israel likes to do.
Yeah, I was surprised there. I didn't catch it the first time there, but I wanted to look at one of the scenes again like that, where they're painting them up and stuff like that, you know, just like they did at Boston bombing there, you know. And then right at the closing thing, it says, stand with Israel. I said, whoa.
Oh, boy, that tells you right now. It is. It's a propaganda war.
Yep,
I remember there used to be this wonderful TV show from Canada called Max Headroom. And there was this one episode where the nation was dealing with these horrible terrorist attacks all over the country. And Max Headroom finally finds out the terror attacks never really happened. The terrorists just found it cheaper to set up a special effects stage and create the videos that they were leaking out to say, we blew this up, we blew that up. It was far less dangerous and far less costly to fake it entirely than to actually go out and commit the terror attacks. And it does seem that life does imitate art after a fashion.
I was going to say, after you brought that up, you remember the old show Sledgehammer?
Oh, just dimly.
Yeah, it was a guy that he was totally in love with his gun. Every time he pulled his gun out, he was almost kissing the thing like that, you know, and there'd be someone about ready to jump off a cliff or off of a building like that, and he'd pull his gun out, and he'd fire a bunch of shots like that to get the guy to jump back into the window like that. But he'd always compliment his gun like that. I could just see that being played on today's TV.
Well, we have one today called Justified, which I don't watch, but from the trailers it simply means to me, every episode is this guy goes out there with a snarky look on his face and, you know, are you going to come along peacefully? No. Boom, 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 boom. It's all, you know, talk about gratuitous gun violence. All righty. Thank you for the call, Keith. We got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back with another phone call after these words from our Welcome back to the show. We're going to grab another phone call here. Kent in West Virginia. Kent, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, something real quick about Morsi. I was watching the other day. We get NHK Japanese television, you know, in the mornings, and they had somebody doing a report, and something very telling was said. he said that Morsi receives his support from the poor people in Egypt. And that is kind of a death knell for the power elite in this country, to have anybody in a foreign country helping the poor people, you know.
Well, that's why they hated Hugo Chavez so much. He wanted to...
That's right. I was going to say that. That's the example right there, and there's many more, but he's the primary one. So I think that's the telling, you know, coming from Japan is kind of about as neutral as you can get, I would suspect. So I think that's something, a very telling comment.
Yeah, I think that you may have actually stumbled on what's going on, because obviously the money junkies want a world where all the political leaders are working for the money junkies and not for the people. And
right.
Certainly we've seen that here in the United States of America under our current fascist dictatorship.
All right. Well, I think, I'm glad you agree with me, and I think that's the truth right there coming from Japan, NHK.
I think that's a very good observation, and I think it's bang spot on, and it does clear up some of the murkiness over just what's going on over there in Egypt. Going to switch over to Pete in California. Pete, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Mike, I'm the guy who sent you the caricature from the haunted castle, not the Magic Castle.
Oh, yeah, I remember you now.
Okay, the thing I'd like to bring up is there was a book and a movie from, I think the book was put out in 1959, called On the Beach. Are you familiar with it?
Oh, yeah. In fact, it's been running on cable this last week, and I keep thinking to myself, is somebody trying to send a message? It's a very, very good but very depressing movie, now that it's on cable, you might want to hunt it down.
Right, because I was thinking of Fukushima and this movie / book, because there is a high degree of relevancy between them.
I absolutely agree. Now, in the movie On the Beach, the world is basically made radioactive in a nuclear war, and the whole storyline of the movie are these people who are down in Australia just sort of waiting for the end to come and how they're trying to deal with it. But in this case, we're not dealing with the aftermath of a nuclear war. We're dealing with the aftermath of an out-of-control nuclear power station. And by the way, some other people, I was going to talk about this later in the show, some other people are starting to ask that question if Stuxnet was in fact a major contributing factor to how bad Fukushima got, because they've gone back and analyzed just how a hydrogen explosion could happen at the reactor, which is what TEPCO was saying was going on, and looking at the reactor structure itself, only if certain valves were opened when they shouldn't have been under software control could these things have happened. And so a lot of people are starting to wonder if Stuxnet inadvertently contributed to the severity of the disaster. But the amount of radioisotopes coming out of the ground is going up. And I think sooner or later they're just going to have to acknowledge that they're not just dealing with decay processes in those ruined reactor rods. They're dealing with outright spontaneous, uncontrollable nuclear fission down there in the ground. And it's only going to get worse from here. It doesn't matter how much water they pour in there. The water is simply being boiled off, boiled into steam, and it's just pouring into the Pacific Ocean. And so even without death from radioactivity, which is the end of the process that they are talking about On the Beach, we're looking at massive toxification of the human food supply in the Pacific. We're looking at huge amounts of radiation that are going to cause all kinds of cancers, illnesses, and death, like we saw around Chernobyl, still to this very day, still see around Chernobyl.
And Fallujah.
And Fallujah from the depleted uranium weapons. And it is rather alarming how cavalier the world's leadership is with these highly dangerous technologies, whether it's poorly built, poorly maintained nuclear reactors. And we're hearing all kinds of stories all over the United States about many of these nuclear power stations that are being allowed to run past their expected lifespan, starting to develop major problems. And an interesting story came out today where the government is now announcing that America's nuclear power plants are potential targets for terrorists. And so obviously the plan is going to be the next time there's a major meltdown in the United States of one of these nuclear reactors, they're going to blame terrorists for it, deduct the responsibility for poor management of the nation and its infrastructure. And then, of course, we have Monsanto and its GMO that's out there causing all kinds of problems. And the people who are making money off of this, they don't care. If they lay waste to 3/4 of the world, it doesn't matter as long as the remaining 1/4 are loyal, obedient slaves.
One other point. The movie On the Beach is also available on YouTube.
Ah, okay. I was not aware of that. I mean, it is a classic movie, And it was created as a form of protest during a period of U.S. major nuclear weapons buildup. And it is definitely worth watching, either on your cable channel or over on YouTube. It's depressing, but it's a well-crafted movie. It's a well-crafted movie.
One of the stars is Gregory Peck.
Yes.
Okay, that's all I had to say. So thank you very much, and back to listening to you.
All right, thanks an awful lot. Yes, it was, a lot of big stars. Anthony Hopkins is in it. I'm going down it's a lot of big stars were in this movie. They all wanted to make this movie because everybody was very concerned about the incredible power of these nuclear weapons. And this was all occurring during a time when there was still above-ground nuclear testing going on. Down here in the Pacific Ocean, they were blowing up entire coral atolls with these giant multi-megaton hydrogen bombs. There were some very horrible accidents that happened. There was one bomb that yielded 3 times the energy that the scientists were predicting it was going to do, and it caught a Japanese fishing ship in the fallout. And the U.S. government didn't tell the Japanese government about it. And this fishing trawler went back to Japan. They unloaded their cargo of fish. It was sold into the Japanese population and triggered all kinds of cancers and leukemias. So it was just horribly, horribly mismanaged. And we understand, looking back now from an era where we know the government provably lied to us about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. And we look back at history with new, wiser, sadder eyes and realize, the government's been behaving like this all along. It's not a new phenomenon. A lot of people talking about that concept as we come up on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I mean, these days, pretty much everybody understands that, yes, Kennedy was assassinated. It was a government conspiracy in partnership with elements from Israel, organized crime, and the CIA was right at the heart of it, and everybody pretty much accepts that. And so you need to remember that. The value in pointing out where the government lied before is to underscore the fact that one should never assume they're telling you the truth right now about anything. Meanwhile, over at the United Nations, they've released their study on corruption in Iraq. And not surprisingly, of course, corruption is rampant and out of control over there. Things are so much better for the people of Iraq ever since the United States invaded. And remember, a big selling point for the war in Iraq was how we were going to go in and we were going to save those Iraqi people from the evil Saddam Hussein, and life would be better for the people of Iraq. And, of course, quite the opposite happened. And that, of course, is a hallmark of all these U.S. interventions around the world. The U.S. goes in there telling the American people we're bringing them democracy, we're bringing the benefits of Western civilization, we're getting rid of the evil tyrant, life will be better for these people, and that makes it worth all of your dead children. And then ultimately, of course, it turns out life for the ordinary people in the invaded or conquered or coup d'etat country gets worse. Iran is a good example. 60 years ago, the CIA ousted the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh. They installed the Shah, and the Iranian people were shoved down into rampant poverty until finally in 1979 they said enough and kicked the Shah out. We'll be back after these words from our sponsors. America, welcome back to the show. And shifting our focus over to Afghanistan, you know that place where we have been at war for 12 years now? The United States has been at war in Afghanistan longer than we were in World War II. And remember all those promises we were getting from people like Barack Obama about how the war was going to come to an end?
I will promise you this, that if we have not gotten our troops out by the time I am president, it is the first thing I will do. I will get our troops home. We will bring an end to this war. You can take that to the bank.
And then, of course, they were talking about 2014, 2014, 2014, 2014, not going to happen. Story we're getting out of antiwar.com. U.S. officials emphasize post-2014 Afghan deployment. General Joseph Dunford, the commander in Afghanistan, is saying the whole future of Afghanistan depends on keeping U.S. troops in Afghanistan into 2015 and beyond, and says they're working on a deal with the Afghan government on a sustained presence, meaning permanent. They're going to garrison the country. which tells us they understand the instant they leave, Afghanistan is going to start doing what they want to do. So they're having to keep American kids in uniform in Afghanistan forever. Remember, it was a hallmark of the policy put forward by the Project for the New American Century, that it was going to be a century of unending war and conquest to make sure the United States, perceived then as the world's only remaining superpower, would be the ruler of the world. That was what that whole Project for the New American Century was about. It was written by all these neocons. It incorporated policy papers originally written for Israel and then adopted as U.S. policy, including the one Rebuilding America's Defenses, which stated right there in black and white, or in zeros and one, because it was on a computer, that this process of militarization of the United States of America could not proceed efficiently and fast without a new Pearl Harbor. And golly gee shuckies, those terrorists gave them that Pearl Harbor on 9/11, just when they needed it. Remember, the United States government in March and April of 2001 was informing foreign governments of a plan to invade Afghanistan in October. It was reported in BBC, it was reported in Jane's Defense. It was all over the foreign press. U.S. to invade Afghanistan in October 2001. We, the American people, never heard that. We were getting all Gary Condit all the time. We were being Conditized. So that when 9/11 happened, exactly on schedule to enrage the American people to support the invasion of Afghanistan, it came as a complete shock. Now, the U.S. government is back to wagging terrorists at us. And we remember last week they were talking about we got a conference call of al-Qaeda leadership that everybody laughed at because nobody in al-Qaeda is going to be picking up a phone knowing the NSA has infiltrated the entire global phone system. Then they came out with exploding clothes, which everybody laughed at because if you understand the physics and chemistry of explosives, making fabric explosive makes a firework, really, and a little more than that. Magician's flash paper. So they came out with a new one this week. Women suicide bombers will have exploding breast implants, which means the TSA has yet another excuse to basically fondle and grope and ogle your wives' and daughters' chestal areas. And again, the story is out there that they're going to have a chemical inside their breast implants, and then once on the plane, they will inject a second chemical in there that will cause it to explode. Now again, talking about the physics of a flame front going through an explosive, it has to be very well mixed. And that means this idea that they're going to stick a needle in with a detonating chemical, there'll be a little tiny bang where the needle goes in. And obviously the second breast is going to be completely uninvolved in this. So it doesn't even really make sense. They're just throwing this stuff out there, trying to wag terrorists at you so you will disconnect your brain, go back to saluting the flag, paying your taxes, and flinging your babies onto the bayonets of the designated enemy. And what is really angering and insulting is that these propagandists, who obviously have a greatly overinflated valuation of their skills and talents, they actually think people are stupid enough to read this stuff and just buy it without any critical thought at all, especially in this post-Saddam's nuclear weapon age, where people are reading the official government and media pronouncements and they're looking for reasons to disbelieve it. Now remember, propaganda habitually is never designed to survive careful analysis. It's just out there to give people who don't want to think about what's going on an excuse not to. A lot of people still don't want to believe the government has gone rogue or always has been. They don't want to believe that the government they're forced to be dependent on is acting criminally. They don't want to believe that. And they're grateful for any little kind of offering in the media that says everything is really okay, just go on living your life and all will be fine. And that was the American people back in the 1950s and 1960s, who didn't want to hear about torturing prisoners in Vietnam. Didn't want to hear the possibility that maybe the Soviet Union wasn't as bad as the U.S. government made it out. They just gratefully accepted the propaganda because they didn't have an alternative source of information, but those days are gone. We have a very skeptical, distrusting American population, and every time somebody on TV gets up there and starts speaking, the vast majority of the American people are looking for reasons not to accept it. They're looking for the problems, and they'll find them, because the propaganda isn't very carefully crafted. Sometimes I think they're writing these things with a dartboard. And the exploding clothes and exploding breasts is just another example. Oh, it sounds really good in the media. Let's put it out in the headlines. And anybody who understands physics and chemistry knows it's just nonsense. It's not going to work like they say it's going to work. They really, I think it's actually a good thing that government and the corporate media think Americans are that stupid, because they're going to go on making these very obvious mistakes. And they just make themselves look sillier and sillier with each new harangue and claim about the danger from terrorism. And remember, the U.S. government itself admits that in the year 2012, not one American inside the United States died from an act of terror. Zero. Zip. Nada. You are far more likely to be shot by accident by a police officer than killed by a terrorist in this country. You're thousands of times more likely to be killed by a mistake your doctor makes or your pharmacist makes than you are to be killed by a terrorist. But they want you afraid of the terrorists because that is what they can use to manipulate and move you towards supporting the war for the bankers. Now, getting on to NSA Gate, new revelations are coming out, and according to a recent interview by Glenn Greenwald, the worst is still yet to come. He's got his data stash out there, and he's writing more stories on it, and I hope he will certainly be checking his car for explosive devices and disconnecting all of that outside computer stuff, the Bluetooth, the Wi-Fi, the cell phone connection. Because I'm sure he is on the U.S. government special high-interest targets list at this point. But they're now starting to report, this is actually in the Washington Post, the National Security Agency broke its own privacy rules thousands of times per year, according to a new audit. Now, this is going to be a limited hangout, where they're going to say, yeah, they broke the privacy rules a few times, in order to cover the fact that they're breaking the privacy rules all the time. And we know this is a bigger scandal than they're trying to imply with it, because the Foreign Intelligence Service Act Court, the FISA Court, which supposedly makes all of this stuff legal and is responsible for the NSA spying, is now backtracking and saying, we actually don't have the ability to keep an eye on the spy program. We just do these little decisions, and the NSA takes them, and it vanishes into the void. And it's not our fault if they're running out of control, even though they are, in theory, the legal authority, although unconstitutional, behind the NSA spying. So they're already starting to, everybody's running for cover on this one here. Now we're getting another story. This came out of techdirt.com, where the NSA was instructing its own agents to withhold information from congressional oversight. They were being told to lie and conceal information during the congressional hearings. So they're operating completely out of control. The idea that this is somehow all legal and rational and under tighter scrutiny and control, it's nonsense. They're just saying that to lull you into a false sense of privacy so you won't start looking at ways of securing your own data. Because we've proven with our NSA challenges, if you have your own encryption method, the NSA can't do a thing about it. And if 1 million Americans are using their own encryption systems and every one of them is different, that makes the situation impossible for the NSA. We will be
Aloha,
right
America.
back. Welcome back to the show. Now, you remember last week we were getting this story from the NSA that they're only really touching 1.6% of the phone calls. So really, you shouldn't be worried about your privacy. Just go on talking in the clear and in the open. Don't use encryption. Really, we're not paying attention to you. Well, it turns out the NSA, as part of their now admitted violation of privacy and surveillance rules, intercepted all 100% of the phone calls inside Washington, D.C. Does the NSA think the U.S. federal government is a terror organization? They might actually be right when you look at the context of those drone strikes killing innocent people on the other side of the planet. But remember when this NSA scandal started to break, And I reminded everybody of the ugly history of intelligence agencies presuming to take it upon themselves to run the government through extortion, blackmail, and intimidation. And we were talking about J. Edgar Hoover, who wound up being FBI head for his entire life because of his private, secret files on politicians, where he had the goods, the affairs they were having, the corruptions they had done. He even blackmailed President John F. Kennedy over Kennedy's extracurricular sexual activities. And I voiced the warning that the NSA, if they're listening to members of Congress, and we know they were watching Obama when he was still a senator, then they've got the goods on the entire Congress, and they can get Congress to basically do whatever the NSA wants. And the NSA is not an elected representative of the people. It is not a legitimate form of governance, and now we're getting confirmation that the NSA was intercepting every single phone call, 100% of phone calls inside area code 202, which is Washington, D.C. The NSA has said, oh, it was an accident. Really? We didn't mean to. Just a mistake, really. And if you don't believe us, then you must be with the terrorists. Now, Ron Paul has launched his new TV channel, and his first interview was with Glenn Greenwald, who is basically saying that more shocking revelations about what the NSA is doing are yet to come. One of the pervasive suggestions making the rounds is that the NSA is not only infiltrating the entire internet to spy on it, but they're attempting to take covert control. Now remember, when the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency first created the ARPANET, it was never intended for public consumption. It was for the use of the military, the government contractors. And it was designed with no central switching authority in order to allow it to survive a nuclear attack. That is what has made censorship of the internet so difficult. And ever since then, besides spawning off a completely isolated separate net for the government, they've been trying to find a way, as the internet became a public utility by default, they're trying to find a way to put points of control into it. Now, some of the most obvious are, of course, these large corporate mail servers like Gmail. And they want everybody to start using those because those all come together in a single point of surveillance and control. And the possible revelation that Glenn Greenwald is yet to come out with is that the NSA has succeeded in basically putting up fire doors all over the internet that they can slam shut ahead of the next government false flag terror attack in order to silence those who are not going to buy and support the official story. And remember, in the week before 9/11, the FBI went around the United States of America shutting down all the websites of Muslim charities, because they didn't want anybody out there posting messages saying, wait a minute, they're just leaping to conclusions that this has anything to do with the Muslims. And that alone tells us right there, the FBI knew 9/11 was going to happen. They were taking steps to make sure that nobody could challenge the official story being pumped out by the U.S. corporate media. We know the NSA has wiretaps into the entire system. How simple it is to turn that listening device into a switch. And I think that is a revelation yet to come. By the way, if you have your own server, you should have your own mail system running on it. Don't go through Gmail, don't go through Roadrunner, don't go through anything. The way the mail system is set up, you can have your own mail server. So that when Roadrunner all of a sudden locks up, which it tends to do more and more these days, or the government comes in and orders these same ISPs and providers who've been spying on you on government order, the government can come in and say, shut them off. And these ISPs will go along with it for the most part. Now, another story, this came out of RINF.com, talking about how the revelations of NSA spying on the American people have destroyed public trust in the government. And yes, it has, and it should have. When the COINTELPRO scandal broke loose in the 1970s, the American people basically saw the federal government as having delegitimized itself That's why Congress was forced to have hearings and to act. And Congress basically held their hearings and said, yes, the FBI was doing these really, really bad things. They were wrecking the careers of people in Hollywood. They were putting out these phony Black Panther coloring books to try and incite racial riots and racial tension. They were doing all these bad things, but we're going to pass a whole new bunch of laws to assure the American people the FBI will never do this stuff again. And, of course, later on, the Church Committee basically said, yeah, the FBI is still doing it. And more alarmingly, during the Clinton administration, Congress rescinded all of those laws passed in the wake of COINTELPRO. And so now the FBI is, in fact, back out to playing the same dirty tricks they were playing back in the 1960s, wrecking the careers of anybody in Hollywood who doesn't go along with the government agenda, planting false information to demonize targeted groups. All of this has nothing to do with law enforcement or controlling terror. It is, in many cases, crimes committed by the FBI in furtherance of the government's agenda. And that is the reality of the FBI. And don't let all these Hollywood films and TV shows about what great guys the FBI fool you. That's part of the propaganda. Just like Tom Clancy's novels portray the CIA as a swell bunch of Joes who want freedom and democracy, and somehow fails to mention the CIA's links with all this massive drug running, both from Vietnam and from South America. It's part of the propaganda. Meanwhile, the NSA is funding what they claim is a top secret, which is surprising because we all know about it now, $60 million data analysis lab at North Carolina State University that will study ways to glean more information from private emails, phone calls, and Google searches. And it is a reminder that a lot of colleges and universities do get these very lucrative government contracts to develop these horrific things. We had a huge scandal here in Hawaii where the University of Hawaii got the contract to develop and test Agent Orange, which has some parts of the Big Island still chained off because they're permanently toxic. You go in there, you're going to die. And there was a horrible accident in which a couple of students died. But the NSA, apparently unrepentant for its abuses of the Constitution and the American people, they're still handing out money, trying to figure out what they're going to do with all this data they're collecting. And again, it's ultimately doomed to failure. It's going to be as big a boondoggle as the F-35. Because what are they using as the raw source of intelligence? They're using Facebook. They're using emails. Like the American people don't exaggerate about themselves and their lives on Facebook, especially if they're looking for a date. Like they don't brag about themselves in emails and text messages. There really is no way to glean reliable, hard intelligence from scanning the social networks. But they're going to spend however much of your money it takes to prove exactly that, ultimately. We'll be right back after Phyllis Schlafly and Aloha America. Welcome back to the show. And I want to comment on Phyllis Schlafly's report. Now, I don't agree, obviously, with everything she says, in particular her attitude about the gays. I do agree with a lot of what she says. But in this case, she's sort of blurring three different issues into one gigantic China bash that I think is very, very inappropriate. Yes, we know that counterfeiting is a crime. But, you know, counterfeiting, Gucci purses and stuff, only exists because consumers are willing to buy these branded products for their image value, and they will pay more money in order to have the bragging rights of walking around and saying, see, I've got a really expensive watch on my wrist. Not this one. This is a Casio. That's the only reason these counterfeiting of designer brands exist, is because people are suckered into buying the designer brands and paying more to have that label on them for their self-esteem. Now, with regard to the issue of adulteration of foods and beverages, that is a global problem, not confined only to China. We see it here in the United States of America. And we may say, ooh, bad Chinese for putting chemicals in fake booze. But the Chinese are saying, ooh, bad Americans for putting altered DNA into food. And again, the reason that criminal operation is able to prosper is because people want to buy the more expensive alcoholic beverages for the bragging rights. Remember a couple of years ago, we went through this phase of the designer vodka, the high-end vodka, where they had bottles of vodka that were going for $100 each. And somebody actually did a taste test and found out that vodka, because of how it's made, you really can't taste the difference. And just sipping from the glasses, nobody could tell the expensive vodka from the cheap vodka. It's all image. And as long as people are willing to pay extra money to have that image that I am drinking the expensive swill versus the cheap swill, there's going to be an open opportunity for people who engage in counterfeiting. Now, as far as car manufacturing is concerned, if we are angry that GM took all this taxpayer bailout money from the United States government and then went to build a factory in China, that's not the fault of China. That's the fault of the U.S. government that took all the money from the American people, gave it to America's automotive manufacturers, and then looked the other way as they took that money to other countries. And by the way, it's not just China. Ford took their bailout money and built new factories down in Brazil for two reasons. Both in China and in Brazil, the cost of labor is lower because the taxation on ordinary people is a lot less, and because those economies are prospering with lots of well-paid workers, they can buy the cars that Americans no longer can. This isn't China's fault. China is doing what is in China's best interests, as any nation is supposed to be doing, unless you're the United States of America bowing and scraping to Tel Aviv and doing what's best for Israel. So, anyway, moving right along here, we are now hearing more and more that the Tourism Suppression Agency, the TSA, which is probably, I don't know, I guess all of these agencies are sort of in a contest right now about who's the most hated agency. It used to be the IRS was unquestionably the most hated agency in the United States of America, and with good reason. Now they're facing some stiff competition from the NSA and the TSA. But apparently the TSA is now embarking on a program to have armed teams roaming the American public, conducting random searches of people with no suspicion, just on demand. You, really cute girl with the thin top, we've got to search you. Because you might have exploding titties. And apparently last year the TSA ran almost 9,000 unannounced checkpoints outside of airports, which is supposed to be where they're doing their job. Searches at train stations, bus stations, the Indianapolis 500, the Super Bowl, the Democratic and Republican national conventions, political speeches, sports stadiums, shopping malls. Now, to justify the fact that they are in violation of the Fourth Amendment, the TSA is claiming these are administrative searches and therefore exempt from the Fourth Amendment. Now, I've read that Constitution from beginning to end. There's nothing in there about administrative searches. It's just not in there. They're trying to make up a word to say we don't have to obey the Constitution, just like the Department of Homeland Security has declared that any part of the United States within 100 miles of a national border is now exempt from the Fourth Amendment because of the threat of exploding titties. TSA now has 56,000 agents violating the constitutional rights of people at 450 American airports. And in all that time, the TSA has yet to actually find a genuine terrorist. They've stolen a lot of personal electronic devices. They dropped and smashed one of my laptops. They've groped up unknown numbers of women, wives and daughters. And because they don't actually change those rubber gloves from one crotch to the next, they're probably responsible for a huge spread of sexually transmitted diseases. But it's all worth it because we're in a war against terror. Just another joke here. Let's see. U.S. Representative Tom Cotton, he's a Republican from Arkansas, is spending the week in Israel after announcing his bid to unseat Democratic Senator Mark Pryor. This is reported over in THV11.com, and that's exactly, in fact, I'm going to read you the direct quote. Republican Congressman Tom Cotton from Arkansas is spending the week in Israel after announcing a bid to unseat Democratic Senator Mark Pryor. They're not even bothering to conceal the fact that every political campaign in the United States has to start with a trip to Israel. They're not even trying to hide that anymore. By the way, we're hearing a lot of whining and crying and screaming and gnashing of teeth from various Jewish groups that despite pouring $300 million a year into their online and on-campus public relations firms, that American college students are not blindly supportive of Israel. And they're saying all that money and it hasn't worked. Remember, we were talking about how the state of Israel pays students, will grant some of them full scholarships to go to school at a time when American students are having to go hideously into debt for their college educations. The government of Israel is taking some of that money that you are forced to send them and bringing it back to the United States to pay Jewish and Israeli college students to sit on their computers and go out there and pound on websites like mine and Republic Broadcasting. And they're spending $300 million a year. And we are trying to counter that propaganda with spare change, which is a not-so-subtle hint that Republic Broadcasting needs your help, because we're not getting $300 million a year from the government of Israel to counter Israel's propaganda in U.S. educational institutions. We're not even getting $1 million a year from anybody, like Monsanto. We rely on you. And without you, it's not going to work. By the way, one of the accomplishments the pro-Israel lobby has succeeded in doing, according to MJRosenberg.com, is succeeded in effectively criminalizing protests against Israeli speakers on U.S. college campuses. If somebody comes in to make a speech about how great Israel is and how evil the Palestinians are, if you protest them, it is marked on your permanent college record for consideration by future employers. So much for the First Amendment right to freedom of speech without consequences. We'll be right back. America, welcome back to the show. And speaking of Israel, as you're probably already aware, there was a recent bombing in Beirut. Oh, it's those gosh darn terrorists. And it was a car bombing attack. It killed 21 people and injured more than 250 in the Shia neighborhood of Rawais in Beirut. And the area is a stronghold of Hezbollah. So the idea that terrorists did this, of course, was rather absurd. And Lebanon's President Michael Sleeman says he's convinced this is another act of terror by the government of Israel. And the government of Israel has officially responded saying, "Who? Us? How dare you suggest such a thing, you filthy anti-Semites." All righty, moving right along here. Now, Benghazi is starting to come back into the news. Not so much because of the cover-up and not even so much because of the attempt to spin the story off into 400 missiles were stolen, but apparently within Washington, D.C., attention is starting to focus on the behavior of not only Barack Obama, but of Hillary Clinton. And apparently some senators, some members of Congress, rather, have gone public that in the days immediately following Benghazi, Hillary Clinton was literally screaming at congressmen for daring to suggest it was a terror attack. Okay, well, if Hillary didn't think it was a terror attack, what did she think it was? And again, my theory of Benghazi is that it was a staged incident to create a fictional crisis, a new hostage crisis that Barack Obama could resolve, dominate the media with, at a time when a lot of the media thought Romney was going to win this election. Just let the story build, a new drama, a new hostage crisis, and then Barack Obama would resolve the situation and prove that he was being presidential, that he was not another Jimmy Carter, but it went out of control. You had some of the SEALs who ignored the order to stand down. You had people from the immediate vicinity, Libyans just living there, heard the gunfire and said, yeehaw, they're going after the Americans, let's join in. And this carefully staged, managed piece of theater turned into a wild, out-of-control riot in which 4 people were killed. And at that point, they hit the panic button. We've got to shut it down. We've got to shut it down. We've got to shut it down. And they didn't have a coherent plan how to handle it if the operation failed. And that's why, even though we've been hearing terror, 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 terror ever since then, apparently 2 days after Benghazi happened, Hillary Clinton was screaming at members of Congress for daring to suggest it was a terror attack. Then they turned around, tried to blame it on that movie, and so forth and so on. But it's even within Washington, D.C., they've lost the narrative on the propaganda. All right, we're going to talk about the economy a second. And right now we're hearing from blacklistednews.com, U.S. consumer bankruptcies. That means you and I and your neighbors around you. Those bankruptcies have jumped by the most in the last 3 years. Collection actions by third-party groups are at an all-time high. The looting of America is proceeding apace. And we know how they tried to revive the economy, to offer to loan you more money so you could go out and buy stuff. And Americans are saying, no, I don't want to do that anymore. They're learning to do without. The U.S. consumer isn't buying stuff on credit. What they want are the jobs to allow them to earn the money to buy they want without going further into debt to the bankers. And because our entire economy is based on maintaining a state of indebtedness among the American people, it's coming apart at the seams. That whole Federal Reserve system is a gigantic pyramid scheme. And it only works as long as larger and larger populations of brand new borrowers can be driven into debt to allow the creation of new money, part of which is used to pay the interest on the old debt. It's a pyramid scheme. And when you run out of new borrowers, the whole system starts coming crashing down. And that's exactly what's going on here. There's a very interesting and insightful article over at American Free Press called The New Poor. And we have seen the corporate media going on and on about how we're not seeing the food kitchen and soup kitchen lines that we saw in the Great Depression, so obviously we're nowhere near that bad. And it's true, we are not seeing the round-the-block lines for soup and food kitchens that we saw in the 1930s. But it doesn't mean the hunger and dependency isn't out there, because it's hidden by those food stamp programs, the cards. The people who are struggling to survive no longer have to wait in a long line around a soup kitchen where they can be part of a very embarrassing photograph. They're going to their local supermarkets, where they blend in with the rest of the crowd. So the problem is, in fact, actually there. It's just very cleverly hidden. They're calling it the invisible depression, because everybody looks like they're still going to the stores and the markets to do what they're doing, and the necessary public support for them is now concealed, because they don't have to wait in line at a food distribution program, unless it's one of the ones we're running here privately. And the lines for those, I have to tell you, are getting longer. Now, when I made that video for Claire's song, Lord Help Me Make This World a Better Place, the video was about this food distribution program that is being run here locally. And I made it a point to not shoot video of the people who were coming to avail themselves of the assistance without their explicit permission. And so as a result, the video focuses on the volunteers handing the food out, and there are very, very few shots of the people. And the video conveyed perhaps an inaccurate impression that there weren't that many people there. But they were just being held off camera here. Now, Cisco's CEO is reporting record sales but lumpy demand, which is kind of an interesting juxtaposition of facts. And a lot of people are saying this is very reminiscent of November 2007, which was a month before stocks really began to crash at the end there. There's a lot of warning signs out there about what's going on here. And let's just take a quick look here. I know that the plunge protection team was out there working as hard as they could to massage the Dow for the traditional Friday happy ending. The stock indicators are mixed. But remember, this week we had a couple of days of triple-digit losses. But traditionally, historically, the plunge protection team always tries to drive the market back into the green for Friday so that everybody relaxes, has a good weekend, and they come back the next Monday thinking everything is still hunky-dory here. Interesting story coming out of Blacklisted News. If you use the Microsoft Office suite, and in particular Microsoft Word, you need to be aware of something called the metadata. This is data that is stored with your Word document that is not seen in the Word document, which includes its revision history, if multiple people are working on this file. And it turns out that a letter making the rounds through Congress, already signed by 32 members of Congress to oppose financial regulation by the federal government on Wall Street, did not originate in the U.S. Congress. It was actually, according to the metadata in the Microsoft Word document, it was written by Robert Lewis, a lobbyist working for the Financial Services Institute, which is a investment industry trade group that opposes legislation. They don't want Glass-Steagall to come back. They want the gambling casino to go on running rock and roll full tilt boogie. And so this lobbying group wrote this letter, takes it into Congress along with a bunch of campaign checks or very expensive lunches, and the congressman says, I'll sign it, sure, no problem. That's why we're in the mess we're in. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we get back to the economy, Fox News right now is again running the story about how the CIA is now confirming that Area 51 exists. And they are illustrating the story with all these clips from movies and TV shows about UFOs and space aliens. They have got to be incredibly desperate right now. They're trying to find something that will distract America from Floodgate. And they couldn't get their little armed insurrection with Adam Kokesh's march into Washington on July 4th. They didn't get the race riots they were trying to kick up after the Zimmerman acquittal. Man, they are scraping the bottom of the barrel. Flying saucers, space aliens, you were right, Area 51 exists. And again, we've known that for a decade. You know, Area 51, it's right between Area 50 and Area 52. It's just a designation on a map. And apparently somebody really thinks that if they just put up space aliens and UFOs, that we here in the independent media are going to forget all about NSA spying on Americans, all about the rigging of the financial markets, all about Benghazi, and we'll be out there running around looking in the skies. And by the way, for those of you who do like to look at the skies, in the constellation Delphinus, there's a new nova that has just appeared, and apparently it's brightening spectacularly, and as of the last report, it's actually bright enough to see with the naked eye, even from suburbs. So this may turn out to be something quite spectacular here. Now, getting back to the economy. There's an article we're looking at, and we've been seeing more and more of this stuff coming out. This is over at silverdoctors.com. Record high demand for physical gold threatens to break the back of the paper gold market. We've been talking about this for quite a long time. In order to discourage Americans from cashing in their stocks and emptying their savings accounts and going into physical metals, the financial fraud industry, with the connivance of the U.S. government itself, have been working to actively suppress the price of physical metals. And one of the things that they do is they blend the price of those gold futures contracts with the physical supply. And then they take that whole number. Oh, look at all these gold futures contracts. There's a glut out there right now, so the price has to come down. And the London gold, daily gold and silver fix, with the emphasis on the word fix, keeps shoving the price down. And we saw it earlier in the year, a couple of really hard smackdowns, coupled with very obvious propaganda from the corporate media. Oh, really, gold isn't reliable anymore. You should be taking your gold down to the local gold salvage place and just sell it off right now because it's really not reliable and trustworthy. So that the bullion banks who are caught short on what they're supposed to be carrying in their vaults could snap it all up. And exactly the opposite happened. When the prices went down, people started buying gold and silver like crazy. And by the way, Republic Trading Group, over at my website, there's a banner link. Over at republicbroadcasting.org. There's a link to Republic Trading Group. They will give you a good price. They're reliable, dependable. You can get your gold and silver through them, and part of the proceeds from that sale do help go to fund Republic Broadcasting. So getting back to this whole situation, there is now a huge glut of these gold future contracts out there that were being used to suppress the price of gold. And they're starting to come due. And they're scrambling to find the gold to make good on these contracts. And what they've been doing up until this point is these sellers of the contracts go to the bullion banks, the money center banks, like the New York Federal Reserve, and they will lease physical gold from the vaults to make good on the gold contracts. So far, so good. But now, of course, we're finding out that the gold vaults down at the New York Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of France are running out. They've been running a little fractional reserve gold banking scam because these paper promises vastly exceed the amount of actual physical gold in existence. There isn't enough gold to cover all these contracts. They just keep hoping they'll roll over. And it's the kind of scheme that works if everyone does not come in asking for their gold at the same time. But that's exactly what's starting to happen. People want their gold. Germany wants their gold back. Some investors are outraged to find out they have been paying storage and vaulting fees on what they thought was allocated gold and silver bullion that wasn't there at all. It just exists on paper. So we're starting to see a run on physical gold. People are going to these vaulting companies, they're going to these brokerages and saying, I know on paper I have this many ounces of gold, I want it under my own control. And it's creating a huge, huge crisis. Now, most analysts are now starting to treat physical gold and silver as a distinct investment from the paper futures contracts. And, of course, the gap between the two is vast and growing larger. Gold analysts are now the most bullish they've been on physical demand since last March. There doesn't really seem to be a way out of this mess. I mean, the way the New York Federal Reserve treated Germany when Germany just wanted to look at their bullion is raising alarm bells all over the planet. Germany asked for their gold back, and one of the reasons that gold was there was left over from the days of the Cold War, when Germany was still absolutely convinced the Soviet Union could come through the Fulda Gap and take it over, and they wanted some of their gold out of reach of a Soviet invasion. So they sent it over to New York. Well, Soviet Union's gone, the threat of invasion is gone, and they want their gold back. And the New York Federal Reserve says, no, it's going to take us years to get your gold back. So Germany said, well, can we at least look at it? And the New York Federal Reserve said, no, you can't look at it. We're not a tourism operation here. Just because you're paying us money to store your gold doesn't mean you have a right to come in and look at it. And Germany pushed, and then ultimately the New York Federal Reserve allowed Germany to come in and look through the open door of just 1 out of 9 vaults that supposedly hold Germany's gold. And they were not allowed to go in, and they were not allowed to touch it. Now, does that act like a banking system that is operating above board? And honestly, no, it isn't. Because we don't know whose gold was piled up in that one open vault or how much of that gold had tungsten cores. But if everybody who owns gold that is currently on deposit at a bullion company, a brokerage, or a bank, if they start taking their gold out and taking it home to make sure it's really going to be there when they need it, it's going to be a problem. And between now and the collapse of the New York Federal Reserve, I can guarantee you the U.S. government will propose confiscating private gold, just like Roosevelt did back in 1933. They took away the gold from the American people, gave them lots and lots of little pretty printed pieces of paper in exchange to save the banks. They will do it again. I think that's the reason they were trying so hard to get the guns away from the American people. So they could kick down the door, come in and say, we've got it on record, you own 22 ounces of gold, we need it for those poor, suffering money junkies on Wall Street to bail them out. Anyway. Now, interesting little story about David H. Brooks. This was the guy who became notorious for providing an inferior type of body armor to the U.S. military that was used in Iraq, Afghanistan, everywhere. And it was one of those inside sweetheart deals where the U.S. soldiers had to use this armor. Were not allowed to use anything else. And I know this because we had a nephew-in-law who was serving in Iraq. And we were hearing all these stories about how this body armor really isn't all that effective. And so the family seriously talked about pooling together the money to get our nephew-in-law what's called Dragon Scale, which is the absolute best. U.S. officers wear it, but not the regular soldiers. And we were told that soldiers would not be allowed to use body armor provided by their family in place of the product from David H. Brooks, because if they wound up getting killed, the U.S. would disavow any responsibility in terms of death benefits. So it was this idea of an inferior product our soldiers were forced to use. And Brooks made a huge amount of money and was notorious for taking some of that money and throwing a $10 million bat mitzvah for his daughter, where he hired people like Tom Petty, Aerosmith, and the Eagles to come in and perform at her bat mitzvah. Huge amounts of money. Well, he is now in prison for 17 years for running a $185 million stock swindle on his own body armor company. Goodbye and good riddance. That's one down. We'll be right back after these commercials. Hi, America. Welcome back to the last segment of our show today here. And I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts as we head into the weekend. And I think it's sparked by this bizarre story that is all over the media about how the CIA has finally declassified the existence of Area 51, which is a non-story. It's a non-story. The existence of Groom Lake and these various designated areas for testing out in Nevada, it's old news. And so for them to be trying to make a big deal about this, and as we saw on Fox News, trying to link it to UFOs and space aliens, they're actually trying to wave space aliens and UFOs and stuff as a distraction. And if they're down to using that to try and take the heat off the NSA, the IRS, the TSA, the White House, Benghazi, they're grasping at straws. They are really grasping at straws. And I think it'll be interesting to see how many TV shows and movies start showing up on the cable news network about flying saucers and space aliens and all the rest of that stuff. But if they're down to playing this card, they're running out of options. And you know what's really funny? There's this wonderful movie by Michael Moore called Canadian Bacon. And in it, there is a scene where, because the Soviet Union has collapsed and the U.S. doesn't have an enemy anymore, the economy, which was based on war, is falling apart, which is sort of where we are right now. And there's this meeting with the president, played by Alan Alda, and they're going on about, we need a new enemy. How about this guy? Oh, he's dead. How about that guy? Well, he's in prison making license plates. How about this guy? How about global terrorism? Well, I don't know. How about space aliens? And it's funny, and we would laugh, except that we're seeing our government do exactly that right now. They couldn't get an armed insurrection with Adam Kokesh. They couldn't get race riots with George Zimmerman. So now they're going to wave flying saucers at us. And we know there actually was a plan that was being developed. Oh, I'm sorry. I do have one more hour to go. Okay, I misread the clock. My bad. So, basically, if they're down to this kind of stuff, what Bigfoot next, Loch Ness Monster, Champy, whatever, they really do have to be desperate to try this stuff. Anyway, pulling back from my goof about last segment of the show, I absolutely misread the clock. Interesting story over at CGR.org. Does Gannett think its own papers matter? And the story is basically how the corporate media, especially newspapers, are in dire, dire financial trouble. And they're having to let staff go. And we know this because when I was still back producing TV commercials, the last time I went down to one of the local network affiliates, that building was just an empty barn. They had a couple of top managers and a bunch of free unpaid college interns, and that was it. Most of the offices were empty, gathering dust. And the point of this article that I'm talking about was that you're not finding any reporting about massive layoffs by the newspapers inside the newspapers. Maybe the people laid off were the ones that were going to report on it. And I have zero sympathy at this point for the corporate media. They did this to themselves. All these big newspapers, all of these TV news channels, they chose of their own free will to go along with the lies about Saddam's nuclear weapons, the lies about Vince Foster, the lies about the economy, the lies about Mena, Arkansas, and government-sanctioned cocaine running, lies about the wars, and on and on and on and on. And now that track record of mendacity has caught up with them because the public doesn't trust the government, and the people, let me back up here again. The people have lost trust in the corporate media. The people have lost trust in the government. And they are flocking to the blogs and the independent media to find the information they need to have to make good choices. It's a wild frontier out here, and the government's thrashing around trying to figure out how they can shut it down or tame it or domesticate it. We have already seen over and over and over again that the corporate TV news networks and the big newspapers and magazines are engaging in fraud to inflate their audience and readership figures, to keep their ad rates propped up. It's still not enough to save them. Polls consistently show the majority of the people of planet Earth are now turning to the independent media to find out what's going on in the world. Like I said earlier in the show, Israel is taking some of that money you are forced to send them for their defense, supposedly. $300 million a year is being poured back into propaganda operations in the United States of America to keep you believing the lies. I'm going to talk a little bit about gun rights and gun issues. Apparently there's been another story of a woman with a legally owned firearm thwarting a robbery at a Denny's. And the interesting part of this story is no bystanders or customers were injured. You know, we always see the police coming out there, oh no, we don't want citizens with guns, it's going to be a dangerous situation. This woman thwarted a robbery and hit no innocent bystanders or customers. Quite a contrast to that shootout in New York at the Empire State Building where 9 innocent bystanders were shot, and it turned out all of them were shot by the police. Now, more guns from the Fast and Furious gun-running operation have surfaced in crimes committed in Mexico. This is a continuing scandal. And apparently one of the guns the U.S. government has been giving to Mexican drug criminals are these Wasser 10 7.62 caliber Romanian rifles. And it's kind of interesting to see that apparently the policy of the United States government is to take guns away from law-abiding American citizens, but to give them to known violent criminals, which I think tells you all you need to know about the U.S. federal government. They are pro-crime. They are in league with crime. They support crime, whether it's Mexican drug lords or Wall Street CEOs. It's a criminal government that is refusing to comply with the Constitution and the law of the lands because they don't see any reason to. Now, I've been contacted by a representative of an individual named David Correa, and it's an interesting story. We're going to try and see if we can get him on the show. It may be a trick because he is in prison right now. And apparently it is a story where basically this guy was given a life sentence for taking cocaine across a state line. And he was set up by an FBI confidential informant who gave him the cocaine, said, just hang on to this for me for a little while. Then the informant went to another state and called and said, you got to drive over here and bring it to me. And yes, this kid, this David Correa, should have just flushed it and said no, but he was trying to be friendly. He thought the confidential informant was his buddy. And he drove over there and he was arrested and thrown in prison with basically a life sentence. And what it tells us here again is that while the FBI doesn't dare actually go after the CIA's cocaine smuggling operation that we saw exposed during Whitewater, Iran-Contra, they're going to justify their salaries in law enforcement by setting up and entrapping ordinary, innocent American people. And it is entrapment. Would David Correa have had cocaine on him at all if the FBI's confidential informant had not given it to him? And the answer is no. And we see this happening time and time again. We're getting another story out of RINF.com. Apparently over in West Virginia, a judge in West Virginia was arrested yesterday for using false evidence against a romantic rival and having him arrested for a crime he never committed. So the whole system is just operating this way right now. Got to take a break for Phyllis Schlafly and some commercials, and we'll be right back. America, welcome back to the show here, hour number 3. Forgetting my little misread of the clock a while back there. Got a caller on the line here, Bob in Florida. Aloha, Bob. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Bob, are you there? I guess we talked him to death here. Okay, moving right along then. Getting back to this idea about just how messed up our police and law enforcement system is, over at 12160, there's a story how a police officer that was in a meeting with the chief of police saying that officers had to meet ticket quotas, recorded it. And basically the police chief was saying there's always a reason to stop someone. They've got so many little nitpicking laws in traffic, in the traffic division. They can always find a reason to pull somebody over and write a ticket. And the cops are being told there are quotas and they have to meet them. That's not law enforcement. That's not traffic safety. It's called pillaging the American people. Now, one of the very alarming developments coming out of Obamacare is this idea that the government will be allowed to inspect your home at any time without warning to make sure that you are not doing something that might adversely impact on the cost of Obamacare. Now, at the moment, they're saying that they're only going to be doing high-risk homes. Families where the mother is not yet 21. Homes where somebody is a tobacco user. Families where children have low student achievement. Isn't that an interesting one? Or families with individuals who are serving or formerly served in the armed forces. Now, we already know that if they get the American people to go for this, where the government can just walk in and check out your home without probable cause, that list of high-risk categories will start growing. First of all, if they know somebody in a home is a tobacco user, they don't need to come into the house. They already know that information. Why do they need to inspect the house if you're a tobacco user? And why are they targeting the homes of our military who are serving or formerly served in the armed forces? Why are they needing to do that? All of this a violation of the Fourth Amendment under the guise of Obamacare. Now, the Internal Revenue Service has now unveiled their official Obamacare website, which is rather amazing because they keep saying they don't have enough time to supply information to the Congress about the targeting of conservative groups, which, according to another whistleblower inside the IRS, is continuing. They got caught doing it. It's illegal. They're still doing it. The entire medical system has become completely corrupted and untrustworthy. Over in Michigan, they just arrested an oncologist on a $35 million scam that he got from Medicare by falsely diagnosing cancer when patients didn't have it, giving them unnecessary chemotherapy, and then billing Medicare for it. Now, chemotherapy is highly, highly toxic. It is not something that you can put into a human's body and not have an impact. I got to watch it up close and personal when my mother underwent chemotherapy for her cancer. And to this day, I don't know if she died from the chemotherapy and the radiation or the cancer itself. A lot of cancers spontaneously go away. Big, ugly secret they don't want you to know about. We're going to grab a phone call here. George in Texas. Aloha, George. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Mike? Speaking of Obamacare, I sent you an article through the chat room about Obamacare threatening charitable hospitals and these free clinics.
I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah, they don't want doctors giving pro bono care anymore.
That is absurd. That is just absurd.
And the thing is, when I was born in a Catholic hospital, and they based my mom's fee for having me delivered into this world on a small percentage of my mom's income, where it didn't break her bank or whatever. And it's just the thing is, like I say, I wish we would go back to charitable hospitals and say these corporate hospitals, because we're going to say Obamacare is uncompassionate. And there's another thing too. Now there's mandatory home inspections under Obamacare if your child has low test scores, or if one of the family members is a smoker, or if somebody is serving in the armed forces or previously served in the armed forces. They get a home inspection under Obamacare. This law must be resisted at all costs.
It is, basically this attack on charitable hospitals and people, caring for the sick and ill on their own. Coming after that, it's all about enforced dependency on that corporate medical system. That is all about making more money from a population made chronically ill by all these food additives and chemicals. It's all about maximizing the money coming out of the population, and they don't care what happens to the population. That's why we have all these vaccines that make people ill, and all these food additives that make you ill. If the American people were 100% healthy, this corporate industrial medical establishment would collapse. They need you to be sick, and even if you're not sick, they're going to tell you are, like this doctor up in Michigan was telling patients they had cancer when they didn't, and giving them chemotherapy that they did not need that harmed their body just to get more money out of Medicare.
Well, I know there was a doctor down in Houston. I mean, he lost his medical license because he was diagnosing men with prostate cancer, didn't have prostate cancer. You know what I mean? And making them go to a whole bunch of sickness therapies.
I got to tell you, the more I stay away from doctors and hospitals, the better I feel. And I know it's just a small anecdotal example, but I'm coming up on my 61st birthday. And so far, I seem to not have picked up a lot of those chronic ailments that most Americans my age seem to have. And I hold up as the counterexample my youngest brother, who we lost just about 2 years ago now. And he had gone completely the other route, had started going to the doctor. Oh, you've got cholesterol, you've got this, you got that. Had all these prescription medications in his medicine cabinet and suffered a stroke. And we know that one of the medications that he was taking is now known to cause arterial plaque to peel off in large chunks, which is an engraved invitation to have a stroke. And we found 2 medications in his medicine chest that you're not supposed to take together, because they can cause muscle tissue to basically break off and enter the bloodstream, leading to heart attack, which is what basically killed him. And he was 10 years my junior. And after what they did with my wife and her joint pain, it's all about the money. It's all about selling product. The idea of actually caring for the health and well-being of the American people is not a concern. It's get the money, get the money, get the money, strip them of their wealth.
Well, this whole system based on lies, whether it's corporations or in the government or the banking system, Mike, I see it getting ready to collapse.
So do I.
And the thing is, and I'm hearing all these people talk about, there's going to be food riots in the street and all this. If they can't get a race riot going, I don't think you're going to get a food riot going.
I would disagree on that one. I'll disagree on that one. I think the Adam Kokesh armed march failed and the Zimmerman riots failed because the American people were smart enough to realize they were being set up. But at the point the system starts to collapse, I think there will be food riots, but they'll be spontaneous all across the nation at the same time, and there'll be really no way to stop it. And if you want to not get caught in that altercation, you really do need to have 2 to 3 months' supply of food stored somewhere around your home. Of course, when the food riots start, I think we can expect the police to start knocking on doors saying, if you have any more food than you need for the next 24 hours, we have to take it. We're the gatherers and sharers, to paraphrase from Lord of the Rings.
Well, I'll let your wife Claire get on right now.
Well, she's not coming on today, unfortunately. We got to take a break for commercials. We'll be back with another phone call after these words from our sponsors. America, welcome back to the show here. And apparently Heathrow Airport is on high alert for the female terrorist titty bombs we were talking about earlier in the show. It's another wag the terrorist at you. And now the U.S. government's down to wagging space aliens and UFOs at you, which tells us they've pretty much run out of anything else they can throw at us to try and distract us from all the stuff that this government has been doing wrong. We're going to grab a phone call here. Alex in Texas. Aloha, Alex. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, how you doing, Michael? I wanted to bring some stuff to your attention and maybe to your listeners' attention. You may know this, but a lot of the HMO corporations, people don't realize the way they work is that the insurance company gives the primary care doctor a bundle of money, a bucket of money every month. And that primary care doctor, when you go to see the doctor, has to pay for any service that you get. So if you have to go to the emergency room, they have to pay that out of that bucket. If you have to get open heart surgery, they have to pay that out of that bucket. And the way it works is the ones that do not give you the care, like let's say you go in with heartburn, they may say, here's a pill, let's see how this works over the next couple of months. They're saving money that they get at the end of the month.
Well, I know.
You know that's how that works?
Well, I think any system that links financial incentives or inducements to the quality of medical care is going to work against the quality of medical care, regardless of how it's implemented. We know that doctors, for example, are actually getting a percentage of every Gardasil shot they're pumping into our young girls and now young boys. We know that the sales teams for these various pharmaceutical organizations literally go around to the hospitals and especially to the conventions and trade shows. They're handing out all kinds of gifts and presents. Doctors that sell so much of their product get rewarded with trips to exotic locations. I mean, it's a completely corrupted system, and it's all about drawing revenue out of the society and into the pockets of these giant corporations. And the actual quality of the medical care, is just not a factor. The United States has the most expensive medical care on earth, and it's something like 33rd, 34th in quality. Our newborn mortality rate is just absolutely shameful. It's down almost in the third world region. And it's just, it's all about pushing product and making money. And
that's right. Another thing that people don't understand, and I have to go after this comment, is that, like, say you're a Medicare member and you choose to go with a Medicare Advantage company like a United or a Humana. If you go with them, that company gets paid anywhere from $800 to $1,200 a month and more, depending on the care that you need. And in my opinion, that is raping the Medicare fund.
Well, it's rife with fraud. It's rife with fraud, but the whole system is rife with fraud. Like this doctor in Michigan, was telling people they had cancer when they didn't, so he could pump the chemotherapy into them and bill Medicare for it. And I'm glad they caught this one guy, but for each one they're catching, there's probably 100 out there playing the same game in a little more subtle way, because it's all driven by costs. Doctors literally are graded in hospitals by how much revenue they generate, not by how many people they cure, not by how many people get killed. It's all driven by their performance review is all about how much revenue they generated for the hospital. Alrighty, so let's see, moving right along here. I am still seeing out there on the internet the carbon Nazis are back to pushing global warming, and I'm rather surprised they're doing it now as we head into autumn and things are very noticeably getting cooler. But again, we're getting word that Obama is going to try and fight climate change on his own without the approval or participation of Congress, meaning he wants to declare a carbon tax by executive order, which, by the way, is illegal. Article over at washington.edu from the university over there, basically acknowledging what controls Earth's climate are changes to Earth's orbit. And they're basically in there talking about a revision to the understanding there. For more than a century, scientists have known that Earth's ice ages are caused by the wobbling of the planet's orbit, which changes its orientation to the sun. Now, the Earth's orbit oscillates slowly between circular and more elliptical. And when it's more elliptical, because of Kepler's laws of orbital motion, the Earth spends more time further away from the sun than near the sun, and that is where you get the ice ages. Then as the orbit goes back to more circular, and the Earth is getting more sun year-round from the sun, the glaciers melt, and we have the interglacial periods, which is what we're in right now, an interglacial period. And the article goes on to basically say the exact understanding of the mechanism relative to the Arctic and Antarctic melt history is being refined, but they're basically reinforcing the idea. What causes warming, cooling on Earth over time is the Earth's orbit. And I don't care how much carbon tax Barack Obama takes from the American people, he can't go out there and change the Earth's orbit. And he can't control solar output, which is the other major controller of Earth's climate. Over at stevegoddard.wordpress.com, coldest Arctic summer on record, keeps getting colder. It's down below freezing early in the season, and it's going down. Going to be a very, very hard winter. Global sea ice area, it was above normal in 2013. Remember all the caterwauling about the Arctic ice caps are melting. There'll be open water at the North Pole. And everybody was saying, oh, well, great, we'll have transpolar shipping. Not going to happen. The ice is back. One of the most common complaints and harangues I got from the carbon Nazis, well, you know, NASA says this is all real, that the world is warming, we got to pay a carbon tax. And as I was saying yesterday, NASA, like any other government agency, is going to do what whoever is signing those appropriations checks tells them to do. And now NASA has been caught tampering with the U.S. temperature record. Remember how some of these carbon Nazis were caught going into Wikipedia and re-editing the articles on the Roman and medieval warming periods to downplay how warm it got and how good life was during those warming periods. When food was so abundant, people had time left over for things like inventing concrete, art, architecture, science, medicine. It's right out of George Orwell's 1984 here. Now, not too long ago, the CEO of the Nestle Corporation, which is now into the bottled branded water market, came out and said that human beings do not have an inherent right to drinking water, that water should be owned by corporations and commoditized and turned into a profit-making venture, which seemed very, very self-serving. Now there's a new scandal surfacing because up in Canada, okay, Nestle, of course, is doing a big business with bottled water into the stores. Nestle Waters Canada. Where do they get the water? They're taking it out of wells in the Fraser Valley. What are they paying for that water? Not 1 cent. That water is supposed to be the property of the Canadian people. Nestle's just pumping it out, drying out those wells, putting it in a bottle, and selling it back to the Canadian people. Over in Oregon, there's still a big stink going on over there because the state government in Oregon has declared that rainwater falling on your property is not your property. It belongs to the state. Those are the king's raindrops, you knave. And it is a crime in Oregon to put out a rain barrel or capture water runoff from your roof. If you want water, you go to the store and you buy it from Nestle. You will be dependent on corporations for your water. Next, it'll be air. You don't have a right to oxygen. You will buy it from Oxygen R Us. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And this time we're coming up on the end of our day's program. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Want to talk a little bit about Fukushima because this is a very serious situation and it is getting worse. And more than that, it is an illustration of a very harsh fact that people are coming to grips with. The United States government, being populated by multi-generational wealth and multi-generational lawyers, doesn't really know how to deal with a genuine emergency. They can't. They don't have the education necessary to do it. We saw that with Hurricane Katrina. We saw that with the Gulf oil disaster. We're seeing it now with Fukushima. The only problems the federal government knows how to solve are the ones it invents out of thin air itself, like human-caused global warming. And by the way, following on this ridiculous corporate media story about how the CIA has declassified Area 51, I'm already getting email spam from publishers with new books about the Roswell incident. So yeah, they're actually going to try and wag UFOs and space aliens at the independent media. They actually think we're going to forget all about 9/11 and World Trade Center 7 and all the rest of that stuff, and we're going to go chasing off the desert for flying saucers. Talk about desperation on the cusp of madness. Back to Fukushima. Apparently, the radioactive contamination levels in seawater off of Fukushima have reached a new record high, 3,800 becquerels per liter of tritium. And that is very, very serious stuff. It's a shame that they can't actually take that out of the water and refine it, because tritium is one of the most expensive, costly materials on Earth. It has industrial uses. And I think it goes for something like thousands of dollars per gram. It's just pouring into the ocean, which means it'll get into the food. Now, tritium is a form of hydrogen with some extra components inside that atom. It can fission very easily. It's also, I think it's a beta emitter, if I'm not mistaken on that. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the show, over at JimStoneFreelance.com, he's got an article out there laying out in very fine detail the exact mechanical structure of those reactors at Fukushima and how some of the things that we are being told happened during that disaster could not have happened unless certain safety valves were not operating correctly. And he comes to the conclusion that Stuxnet had to be inside Fukushima mucking things up. Now remember, Stuxnet was intentionally designed to interfere with Siemens industrial controllers that are standard use all over the world for industrial facilities, including nuclear power plants. Stuxnet was designed to be infiltrated into Iran's fuel rod processing facility for their power station and mess around with the controls on the centrifuges in order to cause the centrifuges to self-destruct. But Stuxnet broke into the wild. It was infecting computers all over Central Asia, Europe. It was wrecking factories. The Russians were very angry about this. And, of course, at the time, the U.S. and Israel were saying, we have no idea where it came from. And then, of course, experts did track it back, and finally they're saying, yeah, it was our stuff. We know Stuxnet was infecting computers around Fukushima, Japan, prior to the tsunami and earthquake. And so it is certainly possible that Stuxnet could have infected the Siemens controllers at Fukushima, in particular the ones involved with the emergency systems, which we know did not operate as they were supposed to during the disaster. What should have happened when the quake and tsunami hit is the reactors should have scrammed immediately and gone into shutdown mode. The emergency cooling system should have come on to keep those reactors from overheating from the decay products inside those reactor rods. And we know those systems did not work. And so apparently I'm not the only person out there wondering if Stuxnet is the reason Fukushima has become the incredible planet-threatening disaster that it has. It is now, beyond question, the worst nuclear accident in history. And how did the government of Japan handle it? Oh, it's no problem, no problem. How did the government of the United States handle it? It's not a problem. Remember when Ann Coulter was out there saying a little radiation is actually good for you? They don't know how to operate and control these systems safely. The safety systems are always cut back by the money junkies, and when it goes kablooey, all they can think about is get the spin doctors out there. Tell them it's okay. Tell them it's not a problem. And now we have this insane amount of radiation pouring out of Fukushima. They're now admitting that tons and tons, hundreds of tons of radioactive water has been dumped in the Pacific Ocean over the last 2 years. And the radiation is getting worse. And the indications are, based on those isotopes coming out of the ground, that they have a runaway, out-of-control nuclear fission reaction happening there underneath that plant. And they can't do a thing about it. They were talking about building a $400 million wall of ice. Now they're back to talking about just concreting the whole thing over and leaving it for 100 years. And that kind of an approach may work in a place like Chernobyl, where it's got land all around. But remember, the Fukushima power station is right at the shore of the ocean. And it was built there in order to use ocean water as a coolant for the system rather than build these very expensive cooling towers. And so it doesn't matter how much they pour over the top of Fukushima's ruins. The radioactive problem is down in the ground. And they can't dig underneath it and put the barrier there. So it's going to go on fissioning and putting out these toxic materials, which are even now getting into the groundwater. Because remember, it's just a few feet above the ocean level, and that means you've got water flowing through that soil underneath. And over time, that radiation is just going to leach out through the floor of the ocean and up into the Pacific Ocean. Unless they want to concrete the entire floor of the Pacific Ocean around the entire country of Japan, this concrete shield they're talking about putting in there, it's just more eye candy to assure the people of planet Earth that the problem has been taken care of, and it hasn't. It's like when Obama took his daughter and went down to the Gulf of Mexico and went swimming in some water that was kind of sort of close to the Gulf of Mexico, but not actually in it, to try and reassure Americans, yeah, you can go on eating that seafood from the Gulf of Mexico. It's highly profitable, and it's not going to hurt you too much. When the new increase in Fukushima radiation was announced, the Food and Drug Administration of the United States of America just immediately came out and said, we don't see it as a problem. We'll test if necessary. And we already know that salmon and tuna along the west coast of the United States have tested positive for radioactive contamination. They don't want you to know because they got to protect those seafood corporations. They got to get you to go on eating that food to make money. And if you get cancer from it, that's okay. We got this huge cancer treatment establishment. They need to earn money. And they have gone so far along in this direction of figuring out ways to take money from the American people. What they were never thinking about is making sure the American people could trade their labor for decent wages and salaries in order to pay for all these services made necessary by food additives and radiation and fracking. The economic system works only so long as currency is flowing at all levels of society into all necessary sectors of the economy. And when you have a corporate and government mindset that is simply take, and nobody is thinking about creating a climate where the American people can earn that money in the first place, the system has to crash. Because Wall Street's article of faith that shaking the money back and forth is just going to make them wealthier, notwithstanding, the reality is that all real wealth is generated by the labor of the people who go out and work to produce a product, to grow agricultural produce, to provide a necessary service that powers the economy. And everything that's built up on top of it rests on that foundation. Labor precedes capital. And when you have a financial system that forgets that, when you have a government that forgets that, you get into the situation we have here right now. It's all geared to take money away from you without thinking about how you're going to get that money to feed into the system. And that's why it's breaking down. All righty, let's see. And of course, meanwhile, in the midst of all this word about radiation from Fukushima, Israel is still demanding that Iran's nuclear power plant be bombed. Got to bomb Iran's nuclear power plant. Aren't you worried about toxifying the Middle East? Yeah, but that's somebody else's problem to deal with. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. Hi, America. Welcome back. And this really is the final segment of our show today. And I'm watching on the corporate media, and in between wagging Area 51 at us, they're expressing concern that oil prices are surging on fears that the violence in Egypt will disrupt Mideast supplies. And what this means is the Suez Canal. And I think we're seeing the beginning of an attempt to create a rationale for direct military intervention in Egypt to protect that very critical waterway. And so it's obviously a very, very, very dangerous time here. Now, getting back to Fukushima, I got one more story I want to put out there. This is over at Washington's blog. Do you remember back when faulty assumptions about the financial regulations led to the 2008 crash along with the outright fraud, and how it turned out the spreadsheet on which all of this austerity program being imposed across the globe turned out to have mathematical errors in it that nobody caught? Well, we've been seeing all across America, we're starting to hear all these stories about America's nuclear power plants having serious problems. We all know what happened out at San Onofre, California. They tried to pull a fast one and put in new, larger heat exchangers, claimed it was just routine maintenance. Turned out that because these were not inspected when they were put in, the heat exchange tubes used an inferior metal alloy. They started corroding early, and now they've just had to shut that whole thing down. Other stories all across America about leaking radiation from these reactors that have been allowed to operate past the end of their lifespan. Nuclear reactors are designed to operate for X number of years, and then they must be shut down. But because of the money junkies wanting to have more profits and lower costs, they keep lobbying the government and saying, no, we can run this another 5 or 10 years. There's no problem there. And, of course, overseeing all of this is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is no more conscientious about the job they're doing than the SEC was about Bernie Madoff or the Minerals Management Service was about the deep crust ocean drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. And it turns out the models they have been relying on to judge the safety of these outdated nuclear reactors are faulty. The models are either erroneous or they were written to basically produce a result that they wanted to have to justify allowing these reactors to run on past the end of their design lifespan. Not unlike the way all these climate scientists were doctoring their models in their computer code to get that hockey stick, because the bigger the hockey stick they got, the more funding they got. And we're dealing here with the potential for a new Chernobyl or Fukushima here in the United States of America. Because they're just going to run these things until something explodes, and then they'll say, oh, golly gee, we had no idea. We thought they were safe. Seeing an article here out of 12160, more evidence surfacing that Monsanto's genetically modified organism animal feed is leading to horrific physical ailments in the animals, which means there is a potential for secondary harm from whatever is harvested from the animals, whether it's milk or meat products. Now, over in the Philippines, the farmers there are taking direct action in the face of GMOs. And apparently, farmers stormed an experimental farm in Pili and uprooted the crop and destroyed it. We're seeing this all across the globe, where the government of Hungary just literally burned their GMO cornfields down after seeing what's happening here in the United States of America. And still, the government of the United States of America insists this is all safe for you to eat. If you're getting lumps and bumps all over you, it's just your imagination, and it doesn't really matter because we've got this very profitable cancer treatment industry out there ready to milk you for what's left of your wealth. Now, there was some concern regarding what's called colony collapse disorder, which is that the honeybees, which are essential to the pollination of natural organic crops, are suffering massive die-offs. And the blame was being thrown all over the place. Oh, cell phone towers are killing the bees. Really? Cell phone towers have been around for decades now. And colony collapse disorder only started showing up a couple of years ago, about the same time that GMO crops started going into widespread use. And there was a lot of research coming out of biologics that linked colony collapse disorder to genetically modified pollen. And this was based on research that was actually published in the journal Nature, I think about 6 years ago, that showed pollen from GMO crops was killing off the monarch butterflies. And Monsanto had to deal with this, and so apparently they bought Biologics. So we're not going to hear anything more out of that company linking GMO products to colony collapse disorder. Somebody wrote an interesting article saying that the United States is now a dollarocracy. That there is no more right, there is no more wrong, there's no morality, there's no ethics. It's who's got the most money gets to call the shots. And that is not democracy, and it's not a republic. It is fascism. And again, I don't have a problem with people who want to be rich. I'd like to be rich myself. But for society to function, there has to be a balancing of priorities. Yes, let's let these people work hard and get rich, but let's not let them get rich by putting out bad, harmful products and then selling a cure for it. By the way, for those of you using Splenda as your diet aid, afraid of aspartame, apparently Splenda is now reclassified to caution after studies showing it being linked to leukemia. I think you got to stay away from all those chemicals here. Raw organic sugar, molasses, good sweeteners. Processed sugar, there's some problems with that. And apparently Coca-Cola is rolling out this new ad campaign to convince America that aspartame in their diet sodas is perfectly safe for you, can't harm you, will allow you to be skinny while guzzling Coca-Colas all day long. There's a documentary out called Sweet Misery, and it's about aspartame and its adverse medical consequences. I had the lady who produced it as a guest on my radio show a long time ago. I'm going to try and get her back. And you need to watch that documentary. It is beyond question there are serious issues with aspartame in the human diet, which means Coca-Cola is engaging in false and misleading advertising, trying to tell you that it's okay for you. And it's very reminiscent of this ad campaign we saw a few months back where the high fructose corn syrup people were trying to mount an ad campaign that really it's just like sugar. You can't tell the difference. They wanted to rename it as corn sugar to conceal its presence from people who were becoming very concerned about it. And high fructose corn syrup is not indistinguishable from sugar. In my case, I can have regular raw organic sugar without problem, but if I get high fructose corn syrup, it triggers a hypoglycemic reaction. And I wonder how many people are going to their doctors right now and being diagnosed as hypoglycemic, requiring costly medical treatment, when all they need to do is stop ingesting high fructose corn syrup. Well, we're not going to tell them to stop doing something. We need to sell them a new product. My goodness here. Apparently the new web blocking program over in Great Britain is having all kinds of fallout in the quest of protecting copyright holders. Apparently they're blocking certain redirection servers. And the problem is the redirection servers are also carrying other websites that are not copyright offenders. They're getting blocked. And the attitude clearly is, we'll shut it all down to protect the rights of the copyright holders, and we don't care if we're getting innocent people as well, which gets us back to that horrible story of McAfee blocking websites like naturalnews.com and demanding $33,000 to recertify them as safe. By the way, Google Glass has a competitor called GlassUp that's marketing or developing a competing product, and they went through crowdsourcing to get their startup money, $100,000. PayPal froze their account. There's the music. It's time for us to get on out of here and get something useful done with the rest of the day. We will be back on Monday here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay well, stay skeptical, stay informed, make good choices. Please support the independent media. We cannot do it without you. Nobody's writing us million-dollar checks to feed you a bunch of corporate and government bovine excrement. We rely on you, and we cannot do it without you. Thank you very much for those of you who've already chipped in, and aloha, America.